Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Resolution Foundation this morning. We're here to talk about young people not in education, employment or training. We probably won't get through the event without using the acronym NEETs, but we can always do our best. If you don't know that there are approaching 1 million young people not in education, employment or training, then you probably haven't listened to enough interviews with government ministers over the last 6 months. It was often quoted as quite a stark misnomer in the welfare debacle around disability payments in the spring. More recently, we've seen much more sensible targeted action from the government. We had an announcement of a youth guarantee at Labour Party conference, and we had a skills white paper yesterday with some bits of relevance that I'm sure we'll touch on. But when a number gets such prominence, we at Resolution Foundation get itchy to understand it better. So we started with a question about checking that this number was true, given it's based on labour market data that we have come not to always trust. But I think we've, in the end, delved into it much more deeply and tried to really understand the trends of who are these young people, should we be worried about this trend, what might happen in the future, and therefore what policy solutions might be appropriate and might work. So I am really looking forward to discussing all of that today with an excellent panel. I'm joined by Louise Murphy, Senior Economist here at the Resolution Foundation and co-author of today's report, by Barry Fletcher, who's CEO at Youth Futures Foundation. They are the What Works Centre for Youth Employment, so Barry can really help us think about the policy solutions. And we will shortly be joined by Richard Rigby, Head of UK Government Affairs at the King's Trust. If you got here today without a hitch through London's transport system, I can tell you that you are quite unique. So we all had a bit of trouble, and I know that Richard will be here very soon. So without further ado, Louise, tell us about today's report.
Great, thank you, Ruth, and thank you also to my co-author, Julia Denise, and we also want to say a big thank you to the Health Foundation, who kindly supported this piece of work. So as Ruth said, you don't have to turn far to see headlines or hear government officials on the radio talking about the number of young people not in education, employment or training. This number now stands just short of 1 million. And of course that makes the news because it's an easy, catchy number, but we think it does deserve to be taken seriously. As we can see on this chart, what's concerning is that we haven't had the number of young people being close to 1 million in over a decade. And concerningly, what we see is a reversal of some of the good trends that were present in the 2010s. Indeed, in the run-up to the pandemic, what we saw was a gradual but steady decline in the number of young people not in work or education. Now, as Ruth alluded to, we at the Resolution Foundation have some scepticism about the quality of the labour force survey. In particular, we think it's not necessarily doing a very good job of tracking employment trends in the last couple of years. So when we started this project, we thought the first task was to check, are there really 1 million young people who are NEET? What we did was corroborate the trends in the labour force survey with our own NEETs estimate using administrative data sources. For example, payroll employment information and data on the number of young people in college or university. And what we find is a strikingly similar trend, that the number of NEETs fell during the pandemic years as more young people entered education, but have risen in the last 2 years in particular, reflecting stalling education participation and falling employment. So we think it's clear that we're not being led astray by bad data, and instead this is a genuine problem that deserves to be taken seriously. But before we can jump into thinking about policy solutions, we think it's important to work a bit harder to understand who these young people really are. And we think 2 trends really stand out. The first, as we can see on the blue line on this chart, is that a steady proportion of young people who are NEET are unemployed, that is, actively searching for jobs but not finding them. This now stands around 2 in 5 NEET young people, a number that we shouldn't ignore. But what we also see in this chart is that there's been steady progress and change over time when it comes to the makeup of young people who are economically inactive. The good progress, what we can see is a falling number of young people, predominantly young women, who are out of work looking after children predominantly, caring for others. On the flip side, and more concerningly, and something we hear about quite a lot in recent months and years, is a rising number of young people who are out of work due to poor health or disability. This now accounts for over a quarter of young people who are NEET, and we think this is a really important trend to bear in mind. And what we think this story tells us is something quite concerning, that our NEET population is becoming increasingly detached from the labour market. Part of that reflects this shift in economic inactivity, the fact that a falling proportion of young people are actively looking for jobs. But what we also found is that a growing share of NEET young people have never had a paid job. So now around 3 in 5 young people who are NEET have never had experience in the world of work. This does reflect some wider societal trends, the fact that in general young people are taking longer to get a Saturday job or work during the holidays. But why we think this is concerning is that for this group of NEET young people, they face real barriers to getting a foot into a good job or to entering education. Now, as well as these trends that might be well known about the 1 million young people who are NEET, we do think there's a few misconceptions around this problem. And so there's 3 key trends that we think are worth clearing up. The first is that despite increasing chatter about graduates and whether or not AI is stealing graduate employment, we think it's important not to forget that in fact it is lower qualified young people who have by far the greatest risk of being NEET. What we see here is that for both 18 to 21 year olds and 22 to 24 year olds, it's lower qualified young people who are more likely to be NEET. Indeed, even among the 22 to 24 year old age group, where there are more graduates, it's still the case that a young person whose highest qualification is at GCSE level or below is 3 times as likely to be NEET than their graduate counterpart. Second of all, and again as Ruth mentioned, there's quite a lot of confusion around NEETs and young people who are claiming out of work benefits. Indeed, even a few weeks ago, the Prime Minister spoke as if these were one and the same group when he spoke about 1 million young people claiming benefits. It's true that for young people, like for older adults, in recent years we've seen an uptick in the number claiming both unemployment and incapacity benefits. But what this chart shows is that consistently over time, a big chunk of young people who are NEET are not engaging without a work benefit system. In the most recent data, that's just under half of all NEETs, around 400,000 young people. And I think that is important to bear in mind when we come to think about policy, that we don't think that solutions in job centres are going to reach all NEET young people. And finally, it's easy to think that the NEETs problem is just one about young adults, just about young people in their early 20s. But in fact, what we see in this chart is that although in theory 16 and 17-year-olds in England should be participating in education or training, there's legislation on local authorities to enforce that. Actually, since that legislation was introduced, first of all in 2013 and then rolled out more fully in 2015, the share of young people who are NEET has barely budged. And so we shouldn't think that it's job done when it comes to this younger NEET age group. And so having set out what we see as the key trends when it comes to the NEET issue, we now set out some areas where we think policymakers could and should be doing more. First of all, following on from the last chart, we think that there's room to better enforce this mandatory participation among 16 and 17-year-olds. Although local authorities do have a duty to enable these young people to be in education or training, that is poorly enforced, and there is really wide variation across the country in the number and share of young people who are NEET. What we can see in the green is that in some local authorities, in particular in many London boroughs, very few young people aged 16 and 17 are out of education or training. Just 1 in 100 young people in places like Barnet or Richmond upon Thames are NEET or not known to their local authority. On the flip side, in some pockets of the country, more than 1 in 10 16 and 17-year-olds are either NEET or the local authority just doesn't have any information about where those young people are or what they're doing. This is true, as you can see, in places like Herefordshire, Northumberland and Dudley. And I think the fact that some of these people are not known to the local authority is in itself proof that something isn't working right, that local authorities surely can't be effectively doing their duty if they just don't have information about where so many of their young people are. And so we think the government should do more, enforce better tracking and engagement with young people. And it was welcome that even yesterday in the DfE white paper there was a commitment from the department to do better here. Secondly, for the slightly older age group, those aged 18 to 24, we think that the youth guarantee that the government has introduced and has been piloting should be bigger and bolder. So far, the government's policy focus has been on 18 to 21-year-olds. But what we can see on this chart in the green is that there are just as many NEET young people aged 22 to 24. And so any credible policy response that genuinely wants to engage with NEET young people really does need to engage with this older group as well. What we also think is important is that any policy solutions include young people who are not claiming out-of-work benefits. Some recent announcements, including the wage work guarantee announced at Labour Party conference recently, was just limited to young people claiming universal credit. But again, as we can see in the slightly darker bars, is that accounts for only just over half of NEET young people. So you're really limiting the group of potential beneficiaries. Of course, we don't want to sound naive. Of course, any kind of expansion of this policy would cost money, but we think this is undoubtedly money well spent, given that we'd be paying now to gain rewards later. We know that being NEET as a young person can have real long-lasting impacts on young people's employment chances. And indeed, we think that now is as good a time as any to really expand this type of support, given that in recent months the government has received additional settlements for employment support from the Treasury over the summer as a way to try and push through the ill-fated PIP cuts. DWP received an extra £300 million in employment support. And so we think if the government's thinking about how it can spend some of those funds, there's arguably not many better ways to spend it than on NEET young people. Relatedly, we think the government should have a positive ambition to improve the out-of-work benefit system for all young people. What we've heard in recent months is proposals to limit universal credit, the health element, so that under 22-year-olds don't qualify at all. But we think this is the wrong policy, focused on the wrong age group. What we can see on the charts here is that for both unemployment and inactivity or health-related benefits, age 22 really doesn't seem to be a meaningful cut-off point. We should think of this as just an arbitrary cut. And even if the government's sole focus is to save money, we don't think that this is going to be very effective. There's just as many 22 to 24-year-olds on UC Health as there are under 22s, and there's double as many young people claiming unemployment benefits. So we think the government should think again and focus both on improving the health part of universal credit by increasing the frequency of work capability assessments. And we also think it should rethink how we deliver job-seeking support to young unemployed benefit recipients to try and improve the proportion who flow off benefits and into work each month. And finally, we think the government should tread carefully when it announces policy measures that increase the cost of taking on a young person. What we've seen in recent years, and as we can see on this chart, is that youth minimum wage rates have risen quite sharply in comparison to the adult rate, and so they're now much closer to the main minimum wage rate. Of course, this spring what we also saw was wider changes to labour costs, both through the fast increase to the adult minimum wage and the changes to employer national insurance. And we think that the evidence so far suggests that these changes are having a detrimental impact on young people's employment chances. When you look at changes both to employment numbers and to vacancies, the sharpest falls have been in the sectors where young people are concentrated, places like retail and hospitality. And so the risk is, if the government goes ahead with its plan to abolish youth minimum wage rates, that it just puts off employers from taking on young people at all. And so we think the government should not go ahead in this current context with its plan to abolish youth rates, and indeed it should tread carefully when it does increase those rates. We think that it should be very aware of the trade-offs involved between rising wage rates and the potential employment impacts. And so, having set out these 4 policy areas, I will finish up and look forward to discussing with the panel. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Louise. So, Barry, what did you make of that? You're the expert on what works. Really interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. So firstly, I'd say it's a really excellent report, really interesting, I think reinforces many of the trends that we've been seeing over the last few years. So I was going to pick out 3 or 4 areas and just talk through. So the first is, I think the work done to try and confirm that the LFS is showing a genuine rise is really important, because it is, to be honest, a pretty constant refrain to say that that is not necessarily showing us what's really happening. Work that we've done internally certainly had suggested it was, and it's really pleasing to see that in this research. And as you would expect, that's been done really robustly. So I think that's really positive, in not that the numbers are high, but actually that it's clear what's happening, because without that understanding, it's very difficult to then take action. And then the other point I want to pick out is this point around low qualifications. This is one that we talk about a lot, and we think is really crucial. Because although, of course, there are challenges in the graduate recruitment space, and to be honest, I think there are likely to be further challenges in the graduate recruitment space. Some of those related to automation and AI, some of them related to be honest, economic conditions and some of the challenges that businesses are facing. And you often don't see businesses talk about necessarily some of those challenges. There's talk about automation and AI, and I think it's probably a combination of both when you look at where you're seeing some of those reductions in hiring. But we've been doing some work, and we will publish this at some point, around the long run impact of those low qualifications. And I think the crucial point when we're thinking about sort of policy responses is how long term this impact is. So when you look at, and we've been using Leo to do this, so looking at the longitudinal educational outcomes, you see actually that impact of low qualifications lasts into later adulthood. So actually, when individuals reaching into their mid-30s, you're seeing a massive gap between those who haven't got GCSEs and those who have. Now, there is a gap between those who've got GCSE, sort of A-level and degrees, but actually the really big gap is between those who've not got GCSEs and those who have. So to give you a sense of scale, when people are in their early 30s, employment rates are in their mid-50% for those without GCSEs, and they're 70% plus for those who have got those higher level qualifications. They're about 80% for those who've got higher ed, they're about 70% for those who've just got GCSEs. But that gap between those with GCSEs and those without is one we should be really concerned about, and one we should be focused and targeted in our thinking around. And then the other point that I pick out and I thought was really excellent in the report was highlighting some of the international comparisons that there are. Because one of the points that I always make around this issue is it's not inevitable that we have rates. I think sometimes we've got into a space where we say, rates are quite similar to what they have been over the last decade, or they've gone down a little bit and therefore things are okay. But I just don't think that's ambitious enough. I don't think that's ambitious enough for all young people. I don't think that's ambitious enough for the economy and wider society, because we know that there are lots of, as I say, really long-run impacts to allowing people to be NEET when they're young. And we've got a new piece of work coming out doing some of that international comparison work. And one of the areas we look at in that is the Netherlands, which we are often mentioning because it does have the best NEET rates in the OECD. And it's had that for the long term. And actually it has had increases, for example, during the financial crash, but they've then brought those back down again. And there are basically three key areas that I pick out from that. So one is that they've had an ambitious plan and it's been a long-term plan and they haven't changed it very much. They've had a longevity to their policy approach to this area. They have done a lot of devolution actually in this space to sort of functional economic areas, which does align with some of the work the government's been doing. But they've been more ambitious of that. They've structured that really strongly around the institutional areas, especially the coordination between local authorities, education providers, employers, employment support services, and to be honest, in a much more robust way than I think we have in the UK at the moment. They've also had long-run wage subsidy schemes, so we're very pleased that the government are looking at it again and obviously announced that recently. But I think one of the points we'd make about that is that needs to be a permanent scheme. The idea that you just put a scheme in place when you have a financial crash is actually not a very good structure for driving longer-term rates improvement. You can, of course, change the scale and ambition of that programme on the economic cycles, but actually having something permanent that you can improve upon and make work is, I think, really important. You can make that more or less generous at different times, but absolutely having something that you have there that focuses on this area. Because, and this is the key point I'd make, if you look at the evaluations of the UK schemes, both Future Jobs Fund and Kickstart, they work much, much better for more marginalised groups. So those without level 2 qualifications had 2 to 3 times, depending on how you cut the data, the impact than it did for those, for example, who had a degree. So this is not necessarily a scheme for everyone, but it's definitely a scheme that can work for those who have lower qualification levels. And as I've highlighted earlier, they're the group who often suffer long term. Then another couple of points I make is one is the mental health rise that's highlighted in the report is really important and one we've been seeing for a significant period of time. Interestingly, newer survey data is suggesting that is plateauing at a high rate, but is plateauing. But one area that isn't is those with neurodiverse conditions. And we're seeing that now actually flowing through from school age children into the labour market. So if you look at those who have a neurodiverse condition who are NEET, that rate is rising really rapidly. And if it carries on current trends, would actually go ahead of mental health as the common reason. Now, there are some comorbidities in that space, but I think that is an crucial and important consideration, partly because our focus around mental health has a lot been around treatment, and there are some really good treatment options out there on talking therapies, etc. But when we think about neurodiverse conditions, obviously those are lifelong conditions. That's not necessarily a treatment question. That is a question of how do we support young people to be able to work with those conditions rather than another approach. And then on the policy side, finally, I think the key points I'd make are, one, we think we need to be more ambitious for young people. We need to be ambitious for all young people in this space. At the moment, our NEET rates are obviously approaching 13%. I think, unfortunately, they're likely to rise higher than that over the next few years, unless we do something about it. NEET rates in the Netherlands are around 5%. Why can't we reach that? There is actually no real reason that we can't. We've set out a goal by 2050 that we get there, because this isn't something you can do quickly. This isn't going to suddenly turn around. And Netherlands didn't do this overnight. They did this over the long period of time. And actually setting out a long-term goal is really important. So we think thinking about some of the areas that the government is already thinking about are really positive. So we think wage subsidies are important. We think addressing some of the challenges around specialist support, especially for those with mental health or neurodiversity, is really important. And we would really agree with a lot of recommendations about being more ambitious in the youth guarantee. The only point I'd also add, which is the final one, is the evidence shows really clearly that apprenticeships work for young people. They especially work for those who are more marginalised. But we've seen a massive reduction in the apprenticeship opportunities for young people. 75% drop in level 2 and level 3 apprenticeships. And that is a travesty. That's a travesty for young people who want to move into those opportunities. But I also think it's cutting off a stream of really good employees into businesses that are being missed out at the moment. So I think we need a really radical thinking about how we boost the number of young people doing apprenticeships. And I would say, although there's some positive move in those directions, I think we need to go further. And if you look to international comparisons on this, we are unique, but not in a good way. We are uniquely different in the way that we structure our apprenticeship system, not focusing it on young people in the way that other countries do. And we absolutely, I think, need to reverse that if we want to see this problem be addressed. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Barry. So lots there I want to delve into, but first let's welcome Richard. Glad you made it, and really interested to get your reflections on the report, which I know you've seen.
Apologies for the late arrival and fantastic report. Just want to start by us trying to imagine a young person who is celebrating their 17th birthday somewhere in the UK this morning. And there are quite a lot of them, because born in 2008, they were just at the beginning of that baby bump, which went from about 2008 to 2012. So they began primary school, they were born into the midst of the financial crisis, then began when they began primary school, iPad didn't exist, Instagram didn't exist, Brexit wasn't even a term, lots happened, but by the time they were ending primary school, the world went into lockdown. So they're meant to be doing their SATs, those SATs were cancelled, didn't get to finish primary school in the same way that most of us did, making that key transition from primary to secondary school. When they arrived at secondary school, they were there for a bit in year 7, then they went into lockdown again during that crucial time where they were separated from their classmates, not able to settle into secondary school as you normally would do. Then let's say they're then 15, and at the point where they were 15, NHS England were suggesting that at least 20% of young people in that age range had a probable mental health disorder. So that may or may not be them, but it's, let's say, 6 in their class of 30. It's a high number, and that was only 3 in their class of 30 10 years prior to that. So then, and now let's say they're 17 today, that means they're probably looking ahead to, are they going to go to university, are they going to do an apprenticeship, what's their first job going to be? And that, whilst they're doing that, they're also picking up their phone and they're seeing reports that AI is going to take away their first job before they've even had their first job. So we have a generation here who are, the King's Trust are now thinking about how we support them, who there's lots of them due to the age cohort. They're significantly more anxious, and there's so much transition in terms of AI that's going to come ahead that could affect them. Just on the cohort size, so the government do know this, but there are going to be about 500,000 more 16 to 24-year-olds at the end of this parliament compared to the beginning, just because of that mini baby bump that happened around that time. And that is significant because even if you keep the NEET rate as it is at present, that's still about 60,000 more NEET young people, which that would then hit that million mark just on that basis. And then when we look to the impact of AI, the King's Trust recently published a report on this earlier this month. We estimate that over half the jobs currently filled by young people will be affected by AI. And some of that is positive. The biggest proportion there is roles that will be augmented, transformed. Lots of tasks will become easier. There'll be economic gains for those individuals who get skilled up in there, but also 10% of the jobs we estimate will be displaced entirely, and that's a lot of jobs that young people go into, both at the higher end skills, but also at lower end skills jobs as well. So there's a lot to focus on here, and I think on the positive side, politicians, I think, are focusing on this more than they have done across all parties. And it's no wonder, really, because voters are also increasingly focused on this. We've recently polled with YouGov and found that over 70% of voters are concerned about the level of youth unemployment. And that goes across party. There's very little distinction between how someone voted in 2019 and how concerned they are about the level of youth unemployment. Then I think following that, there's the politics of it, but also the economics of it. Looking at this budget, the Treasury know increased youth employment means increased growth, smaller labour shortages mean downward pressure on inflation, and then migration need as well. Politicians are being increasingly asked to bring down migration. We need to improve the skills of the young people and the roles that we have here in the career gaps, and that will help. So when young people thrive, society thrives, and that's what the King's Trust is focused on. To the solution, Barry's touched on the youth guarantee, and the report does as well. With the Chancellor promising the wage subsidy, job guarantee, very positive move. I think, and we've discussed this as part of Youth Employment Group, it's so important that we get this right. We want the job guarantee for those who are out of work for a long time needs to be a standard part of the welfare to work system for young people, not something that comes in just as the Future Jobs Fund did, as Kickstart did at times of potential mass youth unemployment. It needs to be there throughout. So it's important we get it right. That means the wage subsidy for those employers who take on these young people needs to be 100%. There needs to be a significant amount of money there for wraparound employability support to support these young people whilst in those roles. And we need to build it up to make sure it works from scratch very carefully, and it should be in place from now until, you can dial it up or down depending a little bit on the labour market conditions, but it should be there as an ever-present. Then on welfare, and those young people who are on health benefits, disability benefits, we need to do much more to support them into work. To also enable them to feel confident that they can take risks about potentially looking for work, taking on that course of education, not feeling like they're immediately going to lose their health or disability benefits. They need to be able to be encouraged to take the next step without this potential cliff edge there that then disincentivises that move. So I think we're in a roughly positive space in terms of the political intent, the economic recognition, and so there's reason to be positive. And I think, to sum up, when young people thrive, society and the economy thrives. There's a lot of intent here at the moment. This report is very helpful for putting it all in one place. It's the reason why over the next few years we have this bulk of young people coming into the working system. That won't always be there, but it's going to be this significant generation now where we need to act over the next few years, and we can all reap the benefits.
Great, thank you so much. It's really extraordinary when you think about the journey of the 17-year-old, and we all know we've had a remarkable 20 years, but when you think about going through it as a child, it's really striking. So thank you. We've got lots of questions online and lots of people here, so I'll come to questions really soon. I just wanted to pause on the trends and then the policy quickly with you all. So on the trends, we've had one question online which hopefully we can bring up about other countries and what the trends are in other countries. And Louise, you touch on that in the report, and Barry, you're working on it. So I thought the two of you might pick that question up for us. And then a number of you touched on the future and what might happen. I love the optimism, but there are some quite tricky headwinds that, again, Louise, you touch on the report. You mentioned neurodiverse conditions. And some of those things might suggest that actually the NEET rate is going to rise. So, and then you sort of brought AI into the conversation, Richard, and I wasn't sure if there might be a difference of view there on whether, how much should we worry about AI versus the kind of old-fashioned problem of low qualifications. So maybe we could pick up those. Louise, do you want to kick off on some of those bits of the report?
Yes, I think, I can let Barry pick up on this in more detail, but I think when you look internationally, you can either see that with a glass half full or glass half empty viewpoint. More negatively, the UK is kind of getting worse in our international standing, so we're now just slightly above the European average. We've overtaken some countries who previously had higher NEET rates than us. For example, Ireland is quite a striking example, very similar to us in many ways. Its NEET rate has fallen quite considerably in recent years. So I don't think we should think that like every country, every similar country is having similar issues, and I think there are some things that the UK can learn from elsewhere. But I think just to then think more optimistically, there are countries that have really turned things around, and so I think it's not inevitable, as we heard earlier. We shouldn't think that this just is the NEET picture in the UK and how it has to always be.
Great. Do you want to add anything on other countries or the future?
Yeah, only to say, I think you're absolutely right. We've seen ours rise while other countries have continued to see falls. I also think our gap between our all-age unemployment rate is greater than in many countries. So there are countries who have poor unemployment rates overall and also have poor youth unemployment rates. We actually have a relatively low overall unemployment rate, but our gap between that, which I think is often a more useful way of thinking about the sort of structural and system issues, is greater and is growing. And I think actually, so where we've obviously seen very small increases in our overall unemployment, actually youth unemployment has risen much more rapidly. So I think that's why we need to think about it, and why I think that point around inevitability is we have some issues there.
And how much we're just picking up on unemployment, how much do you worry about the employer national insurance changes, youth minimum wage rates when we just think about unemployment?
Yeah, so I think we are pretty concerned about those. I think it's the combination that's key. So at a time when, and we had some views, and we expressed them previously, around actually there were some benefits to pushing the minimum wage rates up for some younger groups because the gap had grown, and you could see that on the chart that we saw earlier, that there had been quite a big gap, and that percentage of the overall rate had got very wide, and we thought that was probably too wide and was actually acting as a disincentive for young people to be able to go into work, especially for those who had maybe higher needs. But what we've seen now is a combination of that continuing to rise while we've changed national insurance rates, but especially thresholds. So thresholds were the big issue. So what thresholds did was really change, I suppose, the structure of work for many companies. So if you employed lots of people on, say, a 20 hours contract, the cost of that to you as a business went up really, really rapidly. I know IFS did some work on this and showed that that was kind of double-digit increases, sort of low teens. And that meant that actually they had some choices of saying, well, I could employ someone on those lower hours, maybe someone who's in education on a part-time role or in their first job, or I could employ someone full-time who's maybe more experienced. And reality is that you're going to have to change some of the way you think about that. So I think that threshold combined with NI rates and minimum wage rates in what is also a softening economy more broadly, I think is the combination that we're worried about, and very honestly are likely to see those trends continue into the next 2 to 3 years without, to be honest, I think more action than we've already seen.
Great, thanks very much. Richard, what do you think? What do you think the future holds? You ended on an optimistic note, but you've also got the kind of AI issues coming and these cohort effects and rise of neurodiverse conditions. What do you think?
Well, just on that international competitiveness point, when you look at the mental health prevalence increase, mental health problems, that's virtually the same across most developed countries. So really how we support those young people will affect our potential competitiveness massively in terms of bringing our NEET rate down compared to other countries.
And I guess it shows that the connection's not inevitable because other countries haven't seen the same rise in NEET rates.
Yeah, and then on the NI and increases, it's still quite confusing at the moment. If you look at the Labour Force survey, youth employment's gone up over the past few months. that might be partly due to the population going up as well. But if you look at payroll stats, then it's coming down. So there's still a bit of a confusing statistical thing there. But
I go with the payroll stats.
Yeah, I think the expectation is that we will eventually see the impact on employment, but that hasn't quite happened to the extent that it has yet, because typically employers would rise prices before they stop hiring or let someone go. And then on the optimism, I think this group of young people are more sort of connected and resilient than I think previous generations have been. We should give them credit for that. And as Barry says, we do need to invest a lot more through both government but employers as well, and that will make the shift.
Great, thank you. Well, let's talk a bit about solutions, and I thought we should just zoom in on this kind of 16 to 17-year-old question, and then on the health question. On 16 to 17-year-olds, I was pleased you brought out the kind of, GCSE, not having a GCSE question, and it was really striking what you said about the long-term effects of that. Where do you stand on what we should do about that? Equally, GCSE resits seem like a not very successful policy that risks just kind of putting people through the same thing again without changing the outcome. We saw some shift from the government yesterday in the skills white paper. How do you think we really focus on 16 to 17-year-olds?
Yeah, so I think obviously we want to improve long-run GCSE results overall, and that's a much wider discussion and one where others are much more expert than I would be. But I think my couple of thoughts are one, we know GCSEs are crucial. They're crucial not only as a signaller into employers, etc., but they're crucial as a gateway into the next step. So, for example, one of the reasons that we've seen some of those young people struggle to make apprenticeship opportunities is that's become a gateway into apprenticeship opportunities, and therefore we know that then individuals can't necessarily move on in terms of learning and employment opportunities. So I think that's a challenge. So I think actually there's some positive steps in there. I look to those who do focus on this. So although I agree resits have been a real challenge, we have seen actually the long-run improvement in the number of young people who are getting that level 2 through some of that reset policy. But I think the consequence of that for young people has been very poor. So some of the change to things like not resitting in November if you didn't achieve that, a few months before, and you actually haven't had any further education after that, does seem entirely sensible. There's obviously the suggestion around a level 1 kind of GCSE piece. Now, some who I rate very highly in this space, who know a lot about this area, seem to be very keen on that. So I think there's probably some merit in it, because it does give young people that sort of stepping stone into there. I'm less convinced by the kind of alternative qualifications aspect of that, because actually, if you think how long it takes for everyone to know what a qualification is, employers to understand what that level is and to understand that signalling, it takes decades to do that. And therefore, the idea that you suddenly just come up with something new and everyone understands it, I think is a challenge. So I'd actually say it's about how do you improve that system rather than it is necessarily suddenly come up with lots of new things, would be my overall point.
Yeah, really interesting. Richard, anything you want to add to that? And there was a question online I wanted to put to you about youth services, which we've seen a lot of cuts to, and I expect the King's Trust have seen firsthand some of the impact of that, and whether that is playing a role in the NEET figures. Yeah,
so on that 16 and 17-year-olds, there are a group which I think Louise highlights in the report, who that persistent, that 5%, 6% who are not engaging at that age, and there's always lots of focus on level 2 qualifications predominantly, but not so much on level 1. One of our most long-standing programs we run with young people, they don't have level 1 by age 16. They're more at entry level 3 at that point. And that's the sort of programs you need really to really engage those young people who are furthest from the labour market at 16. Otherwise, they're not going to be doing one of the new V levels or T levels. There needs to be that initial entry point, but they're often forgotten about in the wider. There is some focus on them in the curriculum review. I've seen in the interim report they did mention this group, but we do need more of a focus on those who at 16, 17 are at risk of falling out of the system. And youth service can be part of that. because youth service can then join up and re-engage young people if they're linked to the FE system.
And do you think those connections need to be stronger?
I think there's been efforts to make them stronger, but I don't. There's a bit of government disconnect. The DfE aren't thinking about youth services as they formerly did when youth services sat in the DfE.
Should we talk quickly then about health and inactivity, which, as Louise says, is the trend that's on the rise and has obviously been kind of quite a focus in the political discussion. Richard, you mentioned the trends in mental health, which are obviously worrying in and of themselves. What we've made a specific suggestion around more frequent working capability assessments, which just means more frequent checks from DWP about someone's health status. It is a really tricky problem, isn't it? If someone's on a health-related benefit, some of those people are not in a position to engage with the world of work, and the benefit system should just be supporting them to live their lives. Some people will be in a fluctuating condition, or actually we would want them to move through time into employment, and that's proved a really difficult line to draw. Have either of you seen things that can really work in terms of supporting young people either with mental health or with broader health conditions?
So
both too polite.
Yes, too polite. So I'd say a couple of things. One is we do know that obviously some of that rise has obviously had a massive impact on the number who are NEET. That's really clear in the data now. And as I say, we are maybe starting to see that plateau in terms of those different issues, but plateauing at a rate of around a third, which is obviously extremely high, and that is a real concern. I'd say a couple of things. One, on the benefit side, I think there are, and I certainly understand the intent behind thinking of that under 22, because what we do know is that if young people go on to a health-related benefit at that younger age, they tend not to come off. And that has been the case for our wider benefit system for a very long period of time, and that is a key concern. Now, that doesn't mean the answer is necessarily not to give access to those benefits, but I think we do have to think deeply about what is it about that structure and that system and the incentives that exist within it, and some of the differential rates of those benefits are, economically rational for an individual to say, well, actually, if we can do that. And some of the reforms that government were trying to do were about that. And actually, if you look internationally, you don't see some of those differentiation in the amount of benefit given to individuals, and therefore doesn't create some of those disincentives for work that I think our current system does. So I think that's one thing to say. But I think on the mental health side, we know that those issues start early. So onset of anxiety, average age is 11. And anxiety makes up the biggest proportion of that group who are then becoming NEET, who have mental health conditions when they're younger. So waiting till that person is, say 18 and going into adult services, etc., or on benefits to then do something about it, I think is a real issue. We think there are some promising sort of ideas. So IPS, individual placement support, government have been rolling it out through Connect to Work, but that tends to only focus once they've moved into adult services. I think there's something really interesting, and we're building a trial around that, around IPSY, which is actually for a youth focus element of that, but integrated with CAMS. So actually thinking earlier, that 16, 17-year-old point, because I do think there's something here of saying, actually, if we wait, to be honest, our chances of success are pretty low. But we know if we start earlier on that, we can do something about it. So I think those are a couple of areas.
Richard?
A couple of examples, one where this has worked really well, and one where it hasn't. Next week, I'm taking the Minister for Disabled People to visit a young person down in Plymouth. He's visually impaired. He applied for over 200 jobs, was unsuccessful, completely demotivated. But in this case, the job centre referred him to our enterprise programme where he could start up his own business. He now runs a very successful business in Plymouth doing Braille menus and other Braille birthday cards, all sorts of Braille. He's got his workshop. He's going fantastically well. So self-employment is a particular option that should be considered more in terms of supporting young people who need the flexibility. And that's a route that I think hasn't had quite the amount of emphasis from Job Centre Plus over recent years as it could do. And then a not so good story is, I was in our Cardiff Centre last month, and one of our youth workers was telling me about this young person who had significant mental health problems, but was still motivated, had an idea about what sort of career he wanted to do, He looked at a course at the college. He had, and he was coming along to our program as well to build up his motivation and confidence. He stopped turning up because he was scared of losing his personal independence payment. And that youth worker was saying is tragic. I've tried to convince him that, but he was so scared that if he showed a level of positivity and aptitude that he could be at risk of losing it. So we need to try and find a way that doesn't happen, where young people can be supported to consider what is possible without the risk of that immediately being withdrawn.
Yeah, okay, great. Look, let me, there's lots of people here in the room and really interested to hear from you, so let's take some questions. Lady over there.
Is it working? Is it working? Not yet.
Not quite.
I can shout it. They might not hear me on
Yeah,
the
we
mic,
can hear
so
you.
There we go. There we go. Thank you very much. Thought I'd put my hand up first. Sam Avanzo-Windet. I'm Deputy Director at Learning and Work Institute. I just want to thank you, Louise, for shining a light, a really good report here into the tackling the NEET crisis here. It does chime a lot with some of the reports we've been writing at Learning and Work Institute, especially this number, which is half of NEET young people are not engaged with the benefit system. We've been talking about Job Centre a fair amount. We're talking about benefits a fair amount. We have also talked about other issues, but when we think about ambition for that group, what would the panel's ambitions be for that group of young people who aren't going to benefit from the wage subsidy, at least straight away, and some of these other schemes that are in place?
Yeah, really important question. Thank you. We'll take a few and gather them up. There's two conveniently next to each other over there, Greg.
Thank you very much. I'm Mark Brooks. I'm from a new think tank, Centre for Policy Research on Men and Boys. Interested in the figures here, we've seen economic inactivity treble this century for young men. Also, the number of young men who are off sick and therefore economically inactive in this age group. So what do you think is happening, particularly to young men in this age group, and what do we do?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Yeah.
Hi, John McDonough from RecCraw. I just want to come back on Barry's point when he says there's no reason why we can't, because there is, and it's the system. And Richard knows this because the Social Mobility APPG in 2013 found the system was the issue. And part of that is the guidance. And when you unpick what actually goes on in DWP and job centres, they're not allowed to learn, replicate and scale. They're not allowed to know performance because it will be against fair and open competition. They're not allowed to speak to each other and say what works and what hasn't. It's insane. So why are we putting up with this? We had solutions when we spoke in 2013. We're still getting 50% into work, and it's as if it doesn't happen. So what's everybody on the panel willing and able to do to shift this? Because it's a small nucleus of people who are holding this country back.
Okay, three great questions there. So what do we do about young people not on benefits? Louise, you talk about that a little bit in the report. Do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point and easily forgotten, particularly as you say, recent announcements do focus just on young people who are solely in receipt of universal credit. And I think it's sometimes easy to think, oh, well, why don't young people just, claim if they want to get support from the job centre? For young people in particular, often if they are living with parents, they might not be eligible for very much support through universal credit if they don't have housing costs. So we shouldn't think that all young people are going to claim these benefits. I mean, I think it is genuinely not easy if you think of a young person who is, say, economically inactive with poor health, living with their parents. They genuinely day to day are not engaging with many or any state services, so we do need to think carefully about how to engage with them. The thing that I think is important is actually thinking early, thinking about how to engage age 16 and 17, because that is when you do have more kind of link points. So even though the numbers of 16 and 17-year-olds who are NEET is lower than the older age group, I actually think kind of early preventative action is probably going to be more effective. So as soon as a young person drops out of school and college, that local authority should know exactly who is responsible for intervening, making sure that data is shared, making sure they know exactly how and when to engage with that young person, rather than waiting until that young person is, say, 18 or 21, when they might not have engaged with any state support for 3 years.
And I think our starting point, Louise, would be to not see why a youth guarantee or a wage subsidy scheme has to be exclusively available for people on universal credit. That's one area in which the government could expand the scheme.
Exactly. And I think, to give the government credit, it is good that these youth guarantee trailblazers are genuinely all quite different across the country. We are piloting quite different approaches, some of which are very targeted, say just on young care leavers, whereas some are much more kind of open access. And I think we should wait and see what those results are, but I think we should be trialling lots of different kind of open door sort of options to see, what is it that appeals to a young person. And from all the work we've done, just thinking the job centre should not be the default starting position. If you ask a young person what they think of a job centre, the answers are not very positive, let's put it politely. So let's just think, where do young people want to go? Which people do they trust? I think we should start with a blank piece of paper rather than assuming that a DWP work coach in a job centre is the best person to be delivering that support.
Thanks, Louise. Barry, any thoughts on that, on job centres more generally, or on the question around young men?
Yes, I'll do my best. So on the benefit, that's a point we would highlight as well. We did a report recently looking at this around the importance of kind of trusted adults, youth services, wider third sector support. So, great work that King's Trust and others do in this space that I think probably could be expanded from where it is currently. Especially when you think about this question of the youth hubs being expanded, which I think is a really good thing, and we did some work on that and showed the real effectiveness. Because actually, yes, some of that trust isn't necessarily there. So some of the reasons why young people don't claim benefits is because they don't have that trust. Some of it is because they don't think that's a welcoming environment for them. And actually, we need to think about that. We shouldn't just think, well, that's an issue for young people. We need to think about that's an issue for the state, because actually we want individuals to be engaging with services, because we know if they don't, their chances of success are much lower. So I think that's really important. So we think youth services is definitely part of that. Youth hubs is as well. Issues for young men, I think that's a really, really good point. We've done some work on this previously. I'd pick out a couple of things. One is where you're seeing the biggest growth in jobs are in areas that young men have traditionally worked in less. So if you look at, say, healthcare, for example, a massive growth in healthcare vacancies and a reduction in, say, manufacturing areas in many places and other areas, we are seeing some differences there, and that is a challenge, and that is impacting. So I think that's part of it. I think we're also seeing, obviously, some of those anxiety rates, as you highlight, being really high in some of those groups. Maybe that hadn't been before, although the rates among young women are still higher than young men. We're seeing some of those rises being really steep among young men. But also, I think it comes back partly to this educational challenge, that actually the educational outcomes that young men are getting are poorer, and that is then flowing through into those areas, especially as we see the number of elementary and entry-level roles decrease, and that's only going to continue. So I think those sort of themes are important. And to this point around the system, yes, I don't think it's inevitable we have NEET rates at the moment, but I do think our system is one of the problems with that. Our system, in the way that we think about this issue, especially when we think about what does good look like. We have never actually set, for at least since probably maybe New Deal for young people, when they invested really, really heavily in this area and tried to do something about it. Outside of recessions, we've never set what good looks like. What do we want to do? And when you set that goal of what good looks like, that then makes you work back from that to say, what do we need to change in our system to improve that? And we think there's lots of areas that need to change, from the support 16-17 to apprenticeships to employment services. Employment services are just one part of that. Most employment services, even the most successful ones, don't get the majority of people they see into work, and therefore they cannot be the only way that you think about that. So from benefits to education to employment services to health services. So what I would say is we do need a whole system look at that, but I think that starts with ambition. It starts with where we want to get to.
Great. What would your target be if the government were going to set a target?
Well, we think they should set the target of being the best in the OECD. So we think they should be the best in the OECD. That will change, so economic conditions will change that. But if you set that as a goal, then actually you work back from that and think, how do we get there? Now, I don't think you get there quickly, so we think it takes a reasonably long time because some of the structural issues we have are not going to be solved overnight. But absolutely, we should look at the best in the world and say, why wouldn't we want to be as good as that?
We've often debated what the best target to aim for as in the youth employment group would be. I think we pretty much all agree that reducing the NEET rate would be the best, but when you frame it in terms of, so the Get Britain Working white paper sets the target of 80% employment.
Yeah.
I think you could also look at 80% employment of those young people aged 16 to 24 who are not in full-time education. So that's hit about 75% before, so 80 would be pretty stretching, but I think that's a good one to aim for.
How quickly? I'm worried about this 2050. That sounds really far away.
So I think you could massively improve. So if we could get back to, say, in the next 5 years, back to pre-pandemic rates, that would be really positive because I think, very honestly, they're likely to go in the wrong direction over this next 5 years if we don't do anything about it, if we get back to those. And then the reason we set that is because actually that is a really big jump from where we are now. And I think also setting really short-term goals on this would, I think, give us the wrong answer. So a short-term goal would say, right, we run a really big program that gets lots of young people into work, and that's great, and it brings down our NEET rate in the short term, both having people on programs and obviously then moving into work as a result. But that wouldn't address all the structural issues that we have in our youth employment system, which means that our rates have generally stayed at the same, at least 10% for 50 years. So actually, we can't just go, they're going to solve that in 2. So of course, we could be quicker, and we would love it if it was quicker than that. But we think that's a realistic time frame to change the things we need to change in order to get it to that level, because we want it then to stay at that level for the long term.
And Richard, anything you wanted to add on young men or on job centres and how they operate?
On engaging young people who are not in the system, on the positive aspect, so the government have pledged to double youth hubs from 100 to 200. And you may also, they're meant to pick up young people who are not in Jobs Centre Plus already. Then the Jobs and Career Service coming together, I would hope that you'd get more young people engaging through the Career Service into the welfare to works employability system as well. But it's important that government sort of manage the amount of money that are going into both groups, because traditionally you've had it was European Social Fund, more recently UK Shared Prosperity Fund. It's been targeted with reaching the economically inactive young people and giving them employability support. That's now ended. There's a bit of a murky transition going on now. We're waiting to see what it's called the Local Growth Fund and how much that will focus on this area. We do not yet know that. And then just on young men, I think I can't build on Barry's analysis, but all we know is that we're looking to do a lot more mentoring for this group, because there's quite a bit of evidence that mentoring works for young men who have become a bit disengaged.
Really interesting. I'm keen to, there was definitely a question here, Greg, that I want to pick up. There's also a question that's got lots of votes online, and I'm a believer in democracy, so we'll bring that up as well. And if anyone else wants to sneak in a question, we can probably do one more.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth Blakeman from the Department for Business and Trade. I just wanted to kind of challenge you a bit. I think a couple of you have spoken about kind of increasing the scope of the youth guarantee. I think it would be naive to kind of call it anything other than quite burdensome as a policy, both in terms of the government spending and the government resource that needs to go around getting these people the support they need in that first job, but also from a business perspective. I think it's definitely a policy where it's a corporate social responsibility to take on. It's a job that doesn't need to exist within their organisation, and it's going to take a lot of support from these businesses to help these young people into those roles. So I want to kind of challenge you on increasing the number of people that should be in that scope from that perspective, but also from the perspective of this is a group of people who have been out of work for 18 months. Surely the most effective use of funds and business involvement in this problem is to get to the problem before it becomes 18 months and to support people there. So what would be your priority across policy levers that we do have for solving that problem before we get to 18 months?
Cool, great. So youth guarantee, the one online is about SEND, which we've talked about a bit, but maybe we could delve a bit more into what extra support in terms of employment might be needed there. And I think, Greg, there was one question over here we could sneak in. Is that right?
Hi, thank you, Josh. I'm from Amion Consulting. We're a small economic development consultancy, mostly working with councils and combined authorities across the North and the Midlands, and have done some work on like the local get-going working plans. I was interested in your international comparison with the Netherlands and devolution. I wanted to know a bit more about kind of what powers do local areas need that you think that they currently are not getting, and is it a case of we just need to continue with the current route with devolution, or we need to be more radical and bold, and what could local areas be doing with their new powers?
So I might suggest, just because we're short of time, Barry, do you want to pick up that question on devolution, which was your comments?
Yeah, happy to. So, if you look, and obviously the local government structures, etc., are not exactly the same as they are in the UK, so it's hard to make definitive comparisons. But the comparisons we have made are one, they are given a much more, I suppose it would be probably equivalent to our strategic authorities, in that structure. They are given legally responsibility for that within national framework. So there's a national framework that says this is what we're trying to do around NEET, and then they are given responsibility for that. I'd say it's quite a significantly higher level than currently exists in our system in the UK, and that includes that whole coordination point with education and employers and others. They also are devolved the funding in a way that doesn't exist in the UK at the moment. So there is a much greater devolution of both power and responsibility and accountability, and I think that those two would be combined. So I think we could go further on that. If you look at sort of broader international evidence, you do see kind of regional commissioning as being the most effective if you look at impacts, actually higher than local and national. So region, and I think one of the reasons for that is that coordinating role, especially from school into say further education into employment. That's really, really important. So you do actually see that when you look at kind of large scale studies.
And anything you wanted to add, Richard? Or I wondered about views on youth guarantee and whether they're kind of burdensome, or where is 18 months too long?
I think it's hard to get right, because it needs to work for the employer, needs to work for the exchequer, needs to work for the young person. And the young people coming through who have been on UC for 18 months with support, not found a job, it's going to be, we're looking to employers to really take a chance and a risk. That's why the wage subsidy needs to be high. That's why the employability support needs to be there. You're right that hopefully we don't get to a point where many young people are into that scheme in the first place. The majority of investment should be up front. But I think also, if you look at Kickstart evaluation, most employers who got involved, at least the ones that we work with, had a very positive experience. They saw the benefit from both their CSR objectives. The company felt like they were getting involved employees to help out young people at that time, but they also saw the benefit from future employees that they would not have otherwise considered.
So I guess if the wage subsidy is set at the right level, given there's some return to the employer, it doesn't need to be a kind of burden on business. Louise, your recommendation is being challenged. I should give you a chance to defend it.
Yes, I think the first thing to be clear about, because sometimes the language from government, let alone anyone else, is quite muddled. We recommend that the youth guarantee in its entirety is bigger and broader. The wage subsidy is just part of that. So the youth guarantee is also about offering young people access to apprenticeships and training. And for that policy, we think 22 to 24-year-olds are just as important as 18 to 21-year-olds. A few things to note. One is that even though we're doubling the age band, this won't double costs, because if we think in the long run, if we're supporting lots more 18 to 21-year-olds, we will reduce then the number who reach the age of 22 or 24 and are in NEET. So it's not doubling the costs. But we think we need to be realistic, right? If you think of particularly young people with poor health, they might be going through treatment when they're 19 or 20. They might be getting a level 1 or level 2 qualification. There will inevitably be some people that it takes a bit longer for them to transition to adulthood, and who it's not till they're age 23 or 24 that they're looking for that job. So I think we just can't pretend that the world will look different to how it does. And I think just on the wage subsidies, again, just to be clear, I think we don't think that should be a totally broad brush approach. It's right that should be a backstop for young people who are longer term unemployed. So exactly how you define that, that probably needs a bit of thought, but that certainly shouldn't be something on offer for all young people. But if we're thinking about burden on business, I think what we recommend is that the government should think about this in a joined up way, thinking also about minimum wage rates, national insurance. When you speak to businesses, they say that these things are also what is in their mind when they're thinking about taking on a young person. And also the other thing that we've not talked about is employment rights. I think there's a risk, for example, with the day one right to unfair dismissal. This is something that businesses are thinking about. If they're taking that risk of employing a young person, it might make them less likely to do so. So I think we need to think more widely that, of course, a wage subsidy, a wage guarantee might put burden on businesses, but it's hardly the only thing that is going on for them.
And Barry, Richard, did either of you want to come in on this question of SEND? That's a trend that is set to rise, so we need to get better at it. Any thoughts on what works there?
I'll let Richard go first. I think the key for me is we do have lots of intensity matters in employment programs. So when you're thinking about supporting a young person, especially a young person who has additional barriers, we're doing a lot of trials in this area and testing different approaches. And what we see is intensity and duration. They really matter. This idea that there's sort of a quick fix and you can just overcome these challenges really quickly, to be honest, isn't backed up by evidence. And the idea that you can do, to be honest, a really low cost intervention and that will work isn't backed up by evidence. Actually, what you generally need is you need intensity, you need generally quite low caseload sizes for the individuals that are working with them. You need to generally try and combine that with some work experience and skills development as well, alongside the kind of mentoring and support that Richard was talking about earlier on. And there's lots of great examples of that. One of our problems is that not enough young people end up on those programs because they are not scaled and because actually some areas that used to pay for those, some ESF funding, Shared Prosperity Fund, actually have now disappeared. So if you looked at the total investment in supporting young people into work at these age groups, that has gone down reasonably markedly. Really hard to work out. We've been trying to work out what the overall number is, but it's definitely gone down. But by what magnitude is a difficult answer. So I think it is about intensive support. It's also about getting access and giving young people that support, because we know that does work when people are on those programs. It's just that not enough are on that in the first place.
Really interesting, thanks. Did you want to add anything?
We're certainly seeing a much higher prevalence of young people we support with SEND. The question's about employers perhaps not getting back to them. And it's quite hard to, unless you work with each individual employer to make sure that they have the time and resources to be able to get back to everyone. But I wonder what AI and HR systems is going to do to this, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I have no idea. Will employers be able to give feedback based on using AI, based on that application? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I guess we should, it's a really tough job market to be a young person in at the moment. And I expect lots of young people are having that experience of applying for lots of jobs and not hearing back, partly because there's a kind of lower cost of advert and partly because, and a lower cost of applying, which means you get this kind of huge volume, and partly because we do have a job market where we're not seeing lots of firings, but we're seeing very, very little hiring. So it's definitely not an easy time to be a young person in the UK, but I think great to have a discussion with lots of solutions on the table, lots of suggestions in Louise's report, but some other areas I've learned about too: apprenticeships, shared prosperity funding, and what's going to happen to that. So lots for us to do, lots for us to think about. Thank you all very much for coming and your interest in this area.